come. So good morning, everyone. My name's Chris Deeran, as you probably know by now. I'm Director of Reform Scotland. Thank you very much for attending today's event. If I could just ask everyone as ever who isn't either me or Jason to mute, please, so we don't get any background disturbances. I think given the results of last night's vote of no confidence, which obviously dealt a considerable blow to the Prime Minister and which seems to have settled precisely nothing, today's guest feels a useful man to have with us. Jason Cowley is Editor-in-Chief of The New Statesman, which, as we all know, is the UK's premier political, social and cultural magazine. And I'm not just saying that because he's my boss. And Jason's here to talk about his latest book, Who Are We Now? Stories of Modern England. I think from my perspective, today's event starts from a relatively simple premise, which is that we in Scotland have spent decades obsessing about who we are, interrogating our identity as Scots and Britons, and more recently as Europeans too. Often it might be said to the exclusion of what could be considered more urgent matters of policy. But the same probably can't be said of our large southern neighbours. England has 10 times the population of Scotland. It's our main trading partner. And it's a nation with which, I think, regardless of future constitutional decisions, we are and will remain inextricably linked. But for decades, if not centuries, England has been relatively comfortable or perhaps even incurious about its place in things, or certainly its place within the broader UK. Perhaps it's just too big to care, but it seems like English identity has been subsumed into Britishness, with many, both at home and overseas, seeing the one as equivalent of the other. And maybe that's encouraged some complacency, I don't know. And for the past few decades, I think really since devolution began, the English have looked at the Scots with some puzzlement. What is it you guys want? Won't you make your minds up one way or the other? How much independence is enough? How much power is enough? But we've returned that puzzled gaze. We often have deep affection for England, especially when we thrashed them 0-0 at Wembley last year. But England at times seems to us dogged by an unshifting imperialist hangover, unable to come to terms perhaps with the diminishment of its global significance in the second half of the 20th century. It has a curious obsession with class, an archaic structure within which it still seems to be trapped. And I suppose in a more modern sense, we Scots didn't really understand the need for Brexit or the cat's cradle of arguments and emotions that caused it. We don't also really get why it keeps electing Tory governments, especially those led by Boris Johnson. So I think we find England complex, perhaps weirdly opaque, certainly infuriating at times, and maybe a nation that doesn't really seem to understand itself. We have two very different political cultures now, north and south of the border, and I think it's no longer obvious to many that they will always fit together. Even if you're a unionist, there's a sense perhaps of a growing distance between us. And perhaps what was once healthy competition has spilled over into resentment and bitterness, which is to the diminishment of both. I think it's not at all clear to Scots what modern England is or wants to be. So in Who Are We Now? Jason explores the English story very eloquently and with quite a lot of emotion and a sort of gentle humour as well, at both a micro and macro level. And he begins by quoting George Orwell, don't we all? It is of the deepest importance to try and determine what England is before guessing what part England could play in the huge events that are happening. If that was true when Orwell wrote it, it certainly remains true today. So I'm going to have a chat with Jason about his book, and we'll have time for questions towards the end of the hour. So please do send any thoughts you have using the message gizmo on the Zoom screen, please, and we'll try and get to the best of them. Jason, welcome.
Very good to be with you, Chris. Thank you for that introduction as well.
Before we get onto the book proper, I feel we can't really avoid addressing the events of last night, especially given the subject matter. Boris Johnson is a very particular kind of Englishman, sort of uber representative of a class structure that really repels and confuses a lot of Scots. He's a Bunteresque type that seems not to recognise obligations or conscience or very much beyond personal ambition and satisfaction. Maybe you could just give us your view of Johnson, of last night's vote, where it leaves us this morning. That would be great.
I mean, what comes out most of all was that there was no organised rebellion last night. There was no kind of coherent group of so-called rebels as there were when the first confidence vote against Theresa May was organised, when it was very much a kind of Brexit rebellion from the right of the party against Theresa May. So there was no organised rebellion. There were factions from the Brexit right voting against Johnson, even though he was the figurehead for Brexit. There were the sort of continuity Cameroons like Jeremy Hunt and his followers. Believe it or not, there were moralists. There are still moralists on the Conservative benches who were appalled by Johnson's carelessness. And what's being said down here today is, had they waited a couple of weeks, there are two important by-elections coming up. One in the southwest, where the Tories in that particular seat have a majority of over 20,000, and one in the so-called Red Wall of the north of England in Wakefield, which the Tories won from Labour. They'll certainly lose the seat to Labour, but they could also lose the southwestern seat to the Lib Dems, who are reviving somewhat in their old, where they used to be strong when Nick Clegg and Charlie Kennedy were winning seats when they were leaders of the Lib Dems. So had they waited a couple of weeks, the sense that Boris Johnson, who was always seen as a winner, wasn't he? He was always seen as someone capable of winning elections, certainly in England. I mean, he's never been popular in Scotland, but his poll ratings are now terrible. Starmer's polling better than him, believe it or not, on best prime minister, and he's deeply unpopular, even with those who once liked him. And if he looks like he's someone who's now going to start losing elections, then more rebels might have been prepared to vote against him if they'd delayed the confidence vote. Johnson's an extraordinary figure because he's not popular in the party. I mean, what I'm talking about is in the parliamentary party. He's been popular with the grassroots. He doesn't really have a clique, as David Cameron had a clique. He's an opportunist, he's a chancer, but he's also non-ideological. And he's not in politics to shrink the state or cut taxes. He's quite prepared to spend a lot of money. He likes big projects, Gaullist projects, bridges linking Scotland to Northern Ireland, fantasy projects he's obsessed with. He's a fluent speaker, but he's terrible on detail. He can't manage anything. He's chaotic. And he has a kind of great man view of history. He's a classicist, and he has a sort of pagan sensibility, a pre-Christian worldview. He kind of lives in a world of heroic individuals and gods and demons. And I mean, he's a really peculiar figure. You've worked with him. I never have. And I've never, even from when I was a young journalist, I used to work on the Times in the 90s, and I was aware of Boris Johnson and a cult around him. But I've never been impressed by him. I've never read anything that he's written, and he's fluent and he's funny. But I've never read anything that betrayed a sense of moral seriousness, or has maybe changed my mind, or made me think this guy is, a deeply impressive thinker. I don't think he's any of those things. But there's always been a kind of cult of personality around him. But today he's a diminished figure. He's ragged. He looks like he's in deep trouble, Chris. I don't know how much longer he can hold on.
It's extraordinary, really, to look back at his career, and I suspect it'll be even more extraordinary in years to come once he's gone, and look at the errors that he made, the terrible moral decisions that he made, the bad behaviour, and how he got away with it time after time after time, and kept persuading people to promote him and to trust him, and to the point he ended up at the very top of the tree. And I think his sort of his ego has taken him further than his capabilities really should ever have taken him. And he's been found out in this job, because you can't hide in this job in a way you perhaps could have as London mayor, certainly as a journalist, where you can use fancy language.
Yeah, but he was found out before then. He was found out as Foreign Secretary. I mean,
that's true as well.
Theresa May appointed some senior Brexiteers to very senior positions after the Brexit referendum when she became Prime Minister following David Cameron's resignation. David Davis was given the role of negotiating with the EU. Johnson was given the role of Foreign Secretary, and he was a disastrous Foreign Secretary. I've spoken to very senior mandarins and diplomats inside the Foreign Office, and it was an utterly demoralised organisation after he left. And he had no understanding of foreign affairs or the complexity of foreign affairs. I think he gave one speech at Chatham House. So we'd already seen him occupy a high office and be an utter failure in it. So why they thought he would be a successful and efficient prime minister, I don't know.
It is extraordinary. And do you?
But he's a winner. I mean, he gave them what they wanted, which was a majority in 2019.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think that after all this, that it might have any kind of impact on, I guess, the way the class structure is operated at the top of British politics? You know, we've had the odd aberration, but largely, not just in number 10, but in the cabinet, it has been a procession of old Etonians, certainly Oxbridge types, certainly people from well-to-do backgrounds, you know, who haven't particularly struggled in life and have that security of a decent economic support structure behind them. Do you think that, you know, it's been so, he is the kind of apotheosis of this, a certain type, is that going to have an impact on the future of British politics, where actually we start to look for different values that might be found in a different type of person, a different part of the population, or do we just roll on as we are?
Possibly. I don't entirely agree with your characterizations of leaders of the Conservative Party. I mean, John Major was an extraordinary figure to end up as leader of the Conservative Party. You know, the son of a trapeze artist, didn't go to university, worked as a bus conductor in Brixton. I mean, he was a remarkable figure to end up as leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. Margaret Thatcher, you know, famously the daughter of a grocer from Grantham. I know she ended up trying to speak like a duchess, but she certainly wasn't. She was a kind of thrifty Methodist. Yeah. In many ways, a classical 19th century liberal. So and Ted Heath before her was a grammar school boy. Okay, he went to Oxford. So they're capable of throwing up anyone as leader of the Conservative Party, because what they want above all else is to stay in power. Yeah. Look at Ruth Davidson in Scotland. Yeah. And she was a really interesting leader of the Scottish Conservatives. When you know Ruth well, and you know they often turn to a maverick leader in moments of stress or difficulty. David Cameron was a reversion to a kind of earlier Conservative leader, but they only went back to him. You know, in other words, they went back to the future out of pure desperation, because they'd lost 3 consecutive general elections to Tony Blair, and they thought, well, they needed someone who was quite like Blair, actually. Yes. Economically right-leaning, but culturally liberal, and a fluent speaker, and who might be able to command support not only within the party but beyond the party. So I slightly disagree with your characterization of Tory leaders. What follows? It could be, no one knows. I mean, it could be Liz Truss, it could be Jeremy Hunt, who's much more from central casting of a Conservative leader. So we don't know. What the Conservatives will want to do is try and hold on to power for as long as possible. I mean, they are probably the most successful political party in the Western world. They have a genius for survival and an instinct for power, I think. Yeah,
well, good. So maybe just we'll go a bit further back now and get onto the book proper, as I said. In the book, you talk about the post-war period as maybe having been the apotheosis of a common English or British identity, and you write of the Attlee government's insistence on patriotic purpose, the common good and reciprocal obligations. Yeah. And you trace this, and it's lost, it should be said, through members of your own families. The book has all these stories at the heart of it, which is really worth reading, because it's a fascinating sort of exercise in taking the individual and then expanding it into the larger national or global or whatever cultural. You talk about your Aunt Connie, and she's a fascinating character who is born into one era and lives through into the next and sees the things she valued being dismantled and tries to cope with that. I wonder if you could just talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, my mum is still alive. I'm delighted to say she's 86, and she has 2 sisters, one who's 90, and Connie, who you mentioned, who's 94. I recently went out with all of them for lunch for my mum's birthday. It's fantastic to talk to them. They're all wonderfully lucid, and yeah, they were products of the Second World War. As children, you know, they remember the Blitz. They were evacuated from East London, where they lived, out to the southwest of England, And they were very much of a generation that after the war believed in what Clement Attlee called the creation of the New Jerusalem. And in many ways, when Britishness was at its strongest, the sense of British identity as opposed to English identity was really during the Second World War and its immediate aftermath, when the new Labour government swept to power, not New Labour, but a new Labour government, in effect the third Labour government, came to power in 1945 with an absolute transformative agenda, which had already begun actually during the Second World War, when Clement Attlee became Churchill's deputy prime minister in the wartime coalition, and the command economy took over and the centralisation of the state, it became a war economy. And that was continued after the war with the creation of the NHS and the welfare state. And the new towns was one of the, and I grew up in Harlow Newtown in Essex. And really that has shaped my politics ever since, because Harlow was a utopian project. There were many new towns created, but eight in particular were created in the sort of outer London area, because people living in East London and parts of North London, many houses have been destroyed or completely ruined during the German bombing raids, and enormous numbers of people had to be rehoused. And the new towns were created as a consequence in 1946, I think, New Towns Act. And Harlow Newtown in rural West Essex was one of them. And the town was kind of built around small existing villages. And it offered working class people an opportunity to move out from the city, to live in modest homes, but homes with lavatories and small gardens. And everything was provided by the state, your education, your recreational facilities, your libraries, and we were called citizens of the future. And Lord Reith, the first Director General of the BBC, was chair of the New Towns Commission, and he called the New Towns Essays in Civilization. And it was they were utopian projects. And, I was very much a product of that. I didn't know this at the time. It just happened to be where I lived and where I grew up. And someone once said to me that living in Harlow back in the 1970s was a bit like living in Eastern Germany, the old GDR, but without the Stasi. It was an extraordinary place with an extraordinary atmosphere, pretty monocultural. Nearly everyone was working class. There was a small middle class intelligentsia who came to the town because they were attracted by sort of socialist and indeed communist ideas. And there was a very good central library, very good playhouse. And my father was involved on the literary scene there. Nearly everyone supported the Labour Party. But the town began to decline towards the end. There was a huge investment at the beginning, investment in infrastructure and building of estates, but it declined. The investment didn't continue. The next generation didn't share the optimism of those who had come to live in the town. The schools weren't very good, and that sense of decline continued through the 80s. We left in 1983 because my mother she was alarmed by what she saw as the decline of the town, and much later on, Harlow became emblematic of what was called one of the left behind towns, a forgotten place, only 30 minutes from London, I think it's 25 to 30 minute train ride to the stupendous wealth of the city of London. Liverpool Street Station being the gateway to the gleaming towers and the globalized metropolis. But meanwhile, jump on the train and go 25 minutes in the other direction, and you enter sort of Brexit land and Farage land. And Harlow became caricatured and traduced, and that bothered me. And just after the Brexit referendum, there was a killing in the town. A Polish migrant was killed following a fight, and it was misreported as a racist or xenophobic attack. This guy was kicked to death, supposedly, according to reports, by a group of rampaging and racist or xenophobic mob. It was nothing of the kind. It was much more complicated than that. But I went back to investigate what had happened. And through that investigation, I tell the story of the new town. And in many ways, the decline of that sort of social democratic ethos that not only held England together, it held Britain together, and which the Scots in particular shared in and believed in. And as the kingdom has fragmented and as the British state has weakened and British identity has fractured and weakened, I've become more and more interested in what it means for England and English identity, because the strength and confidence of Scottish nationalism inevitably forces upon the English a reconsideration of who they are. So that's really the beginning of the book, Chris, and I use the Newtown experiment as a framing for an exploration of bigger themes and what George Orwell called the social atmosphere of the country. So rather than write polemic or kind of New Statesman style op-eds, it's led by storytelling and narratives.
It's interesting when you talk about Harlow and thinking about Brexit, and there was the great sort of discussion of the somewhere, people of somewhere, people of anywhere, people of somewhere and people of nowhere. And there was a lot of sneering from the progressive side towards the people of somewhere, but I think as time's passed, it's quite easy to see how wrong that was and how important place is to, I think, us as individuals, certainly as a society, and that sense of belonging to somewhere. And I think probably lockdown has exacerbated that, because we've all been stuck for a couple of years wherever it is we live. We've spent more time probably in our town or village or city centres. We've become more aware of maybe the disintegration of the town fabric, of what social activities it has or doesn't have, the decline of high streets and the rest of it. And so place has become something that is much more immediate to us rather than an abstract notion, even if you are an anti-Brexit person or the progressive living in big cities and travelling around the world or whatever. And that seems to be what Harlow gave to people as well. It was a place to exist and belong and to feel common bonds with people. And we kind of lost that along the way over the decades that followed, to the point that perhaps that was really what was behind Brexit, was that sense of needing to control the sense of your the place that you lived and the country that you lived in, and to feel you belonged to it in recognizable ways again.
I think that's right. I think one of the when you mentioned that in Scotland there's a bewilderment at England and the vote for Brexit. There was a kind of ideological right wing Jacob Rees-Mogg style movement for Brexit. I think quite unpleasant. But there was also the vote for Brexit in many ways was an expression of a sense of mass disaffection in many of those areas that you've just spoken about, the smaller towns, the smaller cities, the neglected towns, the neglected coastal regions, the old new towns, now no longer new but old and declining. And when David Cameron asked many people to vote for the status quo, what Labour MPs in the north in particular were hearing when they were campaigning for Remain on the doorstep, people were saying, we like you as our local MP, not had a pay rise for a decade, can't get my daughter into the local primary school, the local hospitals in special measures. And they also were saying that when we go into the high street's neglected, the shops are boarded up, and people are speaking Polish and Romanian. And this is unsettling us. And when David Cameron asks us to vote for the status quo, we're going to vote against the status quo because it's already intolerable for us. And Cameron was saying, if you vote for Brexit, you'll be economically poorer, you'll be worse off. Well, they already felt they had nothing to lose. So they were prepared to gamble on something different. Of course, a lot of people voted against Brussels and voted for greater sovereignty and ultimate control of British laws through the House of Commons. But nevertheless, it was a vote of mass disaffection for many, many people. Now, I know because I've spoken to a lot of people about this, and I've also spoken to a lot of Labour MPs who were campaigning for Remain in what has since been called the Red Wall seats that were lost to the Tories in 2019, the Brexit Tories. And those people may have only loaned their votes to the Conservative Party because they liked the slogan "Let's get Brexit done." No matter how incoherent it sounded to me, they liked that slogan and also they were particularly appalled that they'd voted one way, and then the political class in London was seeking either to overturn the vote for a second referendum or revoke it altogether, which was the Liberal Democrat policy going into the 2019 general election, led by Jo Swinson, who lost her seat actually in Scotland. But it was the Lib Dems were massively well funded going into that campaign. They had a lot of backing from big business and what you might call the Romaniac elite in London. And Corbyn was also pushing for renegotiation and ultimately a second referendum, and it was rejected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the most interesting and actually entertaining passages in your book is when you write about Gillian Duffy, who is the woman famously traduced by Gordon Brown as that bigoted woman when he spoke to her in the 2010 election, and then went back into his limousine with the Sky microphone still in his lapel and started cursing about her to his aides. And then not only did Gillian Duffy have to put up with Brown coming back to her house to apologise, and she didn't have any milk for his tea, but she was then courted by David Miliband in the leadership election. And then when Ed Miliband won, she was brought to the Commons, where he tried to woo her as well. But Duffy was, I think, in a sense, a more important figure than people realised. And for Labour, she should really have been a canary in the coal mine. So she was a Labour voter who'd become disillusioned with the state of Britain. And it's possible to, I guess, draw a line from her comments in 2010 to her vote for Brexit in 2016 to the loss of the Red Wall seats in 2019. They were all being caused by the same things. And for all the attention that Labour gave her, calling her to the Commons, going back to house to see her, they didn't really listen to her, did they?
No, then she was obviously ignored by Corbyn and has been forgotten by Starmer. The chapter in which Mrs. Duffy appears in the book is called A Visitor from the Future, because she appears before Gordon Brown that day in Rochdale. He's campaigning. And she's on her way, as you say, to buy some milk and some bread from a local shop. And suddenly she notices all the limousines and is stopped in the street by a woman called Sue Nye, who was a close aide to Gordon Brown, his gatekeeper. And she says to Mrs. Duffy, "Are you Labour?" And Mrs. Duffy says, "Of course I'm Labour." And Sue Nye said, "Do you want to meet the Prime Minister?" And Mrs. Duffy said, "Of course I do." So metaphorically, the gatekeeper opens the gate and Mrs. Duffy walked straight through it. And I went back and looked at the exchange. I mean, it's actually a very interesting exchange. Duffy's a very sharp questioner. And she's famous for the comment about immigration, but she only reaches immigration much later, having first spoken about the budget deficit, national debt, student debt, decline of the high street. And she's not talking about, doesn't make a racial point. She's talking about freedom of movement within the EU and the arrival of migrants from the east of Europe. And she asks Gordon, and Gordon just doesn't know what to do. And as you watch the interview taking place, Brown becomes increasingly unsettled because he knows he's lost control, and he tries to flatter her, and she resists his flattery. But actually, the reason she's a visitor from the future is because Blair and Brown, they embraced the new market globalization. Blair gave a speech in '95, 2 years before he won his landslide election, when he said, "I want this to be a young country," talking about Britain. And he said, this will be a young country, open, dynamic, plural, modern, progressive. And Blair wanted to escape from the associations of the past, what he thought were the forces of conservatism as he defined them, even empire and colonialism. He wanted to move away and forget that. Even Labour's old working class roots, the unions, people like Mrs. Duffy, and embrace a more Clintonite, modern, progressive identity. And we know that England and Scotland are very old countries. Britain itself is a relatively, not the island of Great Britain, but the modern British state formed through the Act of Union, and before that, the Union of the Crowns. But these countries, England and Scotland, are ancient. And there's a recognisable English nation before the Norman Conquest. going back, into the 10th century, even before that, and Anglo-Saxon England. But Blair was in flight from that. He wanted to embrace a young country. And I remember traveling with Gordon Brown to Newcastle a couple of days before the vote in 2010, the general election vote. And on the way back on the train, it was off the record, we had a beer and a chat. Peter Mandelson joined us. And Brown knew he'd lost. He knew he was heading for defeat. So he became quite nostalgic, talking about the New Labour era and the successes of the New Labour period. And he says, above all else, what this campaign has shown is that David Cameron and the Conservatives, they've campaigned in favour of the New Labour agenda. They don't reject it. Yeah. What you might call kind of the liberal, modern liberal, globalised New Labour agenda. Well, Mrs. Duffy unequivocally rejected it. That's why she appeared before Gordon Brown that day. She was debating the effects of market-driven globalisation and what it had done to local communities and the decline of local communities and the loss of social cohesion and the fraying of the fabric of place. All the things that you mentioned, Chris. And move forward 10 years after that exchange, and look what happened to the Labour Party.
Yeah.
They were utterly destroyed. And I spoke to Mrs. Duffy, and she said to me, and I spoke to her recently about what had happened in 2010, and she said they didn't listen in Scotland either, did they? And if you think, after the independence referendum of 2014, Ed Miliband went into that general election, the 2015 general election, with 41 of the 59 Scottish Westminster seats. 41. And he came out of it with 1. From which there's no return for Labour in Scotland, in my view. SNP won 56 in that election in 2015. And Mrs. Duffy said they didn't listen in Scotland. And they haven't listened in the north of England, where there is indeed a democratic deficit. So I think she's a very, very important figure in the political culture of England.
Chosen out. And one person who did understand people like Mrs. Duffy was Nigel Farage, who I guess is another curious spectacle through Scottish eyes. I mean, he has been immensely influential in terms of what's happened in the United Kingdom, even if it was maybe largely an English audience that he seemed to take with him. And he understood that people were, I think your phrase was, living precariously. Without economic or political power, and he understood that you can't have political power without economic power, and sold that to people about simplistically and provocatively to offer them a way out and a way to get back control of their country. What is it about? I mean, Farage was very plausible, and when you see him talking on the television, he's a very, very smart and he targets his phrasing very well. He avoids any of the less attractive aspects, even if that can be behind some of what he does. What was your take on Nigel Farage and what was really behind what he was doing? Is he what he seems, or is there something darker there? And what made him so plausible to that type of English voter?
I think I've spoken to Farage at length on several occasions, and he appears as a figure in the book. He was completely misunderstood by the left. Some dismissed him as a fascist or neo-fascist. He isn't a fascist, but he does use very provocative and inflammatory language, and he has unlocked certain xenophobic forces. But why he was misunderstood by the left was, I remember Ed Miliband, who misunderstood so much about the country he was seeking to lead. I mean, John Gray, the political philosopher, said to me, Ed Miliband wants to rule a country that doesn't exist. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But Miliband said to me that the financial crisis and its aftermath, as he put it, was a social democratic moment. In other words, the chaos created by neoliberalism would lead to a revival of the left, not only in the UK, but across Europe. And he said, I said, well, what about Faragism? How do you account for the populist right, the nationalist right? He said, oh, no, they will damage the Tories. They will take votes from the Conservative Party. They're not a problem for the Labour Party. And I paraphrase, but that was broadly his argument to me. And, he was completely wrong about that, because Farage appealed also to a lot of disaffected working class Labour voters, some disaffected Conservatives as well, no doubt. I mean, UKIP was a kind of breakaway from the Conservative Party. But Farage was able to address issues that the political elites in London were wary or fearful of addressing, namely immigration and uncontrolled migration. So Farage said to me that he used an opportunity in 2004 when the eastern states, when the EU enlarged and the eastern states joined the EU, the UK chose not to impose 7-year transition controls for freedom of movement. Germany, all the big economies, Germany, Italy, Spain, France, all imposed the 7-year controls. But the UK did not. UK, Sweden and Ireland were the three nation states that chose not to impose those transition controls, because Tony Blair welcomed migrants. He welcomed economic migrants. It was part of his vision of the new dynamic country. But there was a miscalculation. If you recall, Labour said at the time in 2004, they estimated between 8,000 and 13,000 Polish migrants would arrive to live and work in the UK and pay their taxes. Well, we know what happened next and how many people actually came to the UK. And Farage said he used that opportunity to reopen or reanimate or reinvigorate the immigration debate that he said had been closed down ever since Enoch Powell made his notorious Rivers of Blood speech at the end of the 60s. And he thought a lot of people in the country were unsettled by uncontrolled migration, even though these people were economic migrants. You know, they were working, most of them paying taxes. Farage sensed how unsettled people were by this and was able to exploit their unease to great effect. So much so that in the 2015 general election, the election where Ed Miliband lost 40 seats in Scotland, 4 million people voted for UKIP. Under a proportional voting system, we would have had 81, 2, 3, 8 UKIP MPs. Yeah. And that may be an argument for first past the post that we didn't have 83 UKIP MPs at Westminster, but nevertheless it created the conditions, Farageism created the conditions for the Brexit referendum in 2016.
And I wonder what you think, you know, as someone who edits a progressive magazine, I guess, what you think of the progressive misanalysis of so much about Britain at times. You know, there's lots of good things, lots of good arguments, lots of arguments for equality and achievements along those lines, but the refusal to accept the conservative heart of England maybe is something that keeps coming back to bite progressive England, or stick to England for the moment. What's your sense of what is Englishness? How would you define it? I know that's almost an impossible question, but in terms of the kind of people we're talking about, what is it they want? The people who in the Red Wall and in Brexit, and is it simply they want a competent government that gives them a better chance than the old someone to love, somewhere to live, somewhere to work, and something to hope for, kind of thing? Or is there a peculiarly English post-imperial view of the world that needs addressed by our politicians?
There is a sense, I think, through the centuries that Englishness has been associated with nostalgia and loss, and that's not just recent. I mean, that runs like an underground stream through English literature. You know, it's there in Chaucer, it's there in Shakespeare, it's there in the great poetry, right through into the present. A sense that there was always somehow a deeper, purer England that existed and no longer exists and has been lost. And there's also a sense, I think, that Englishness was lost within Britishness. So for many, after the Act of Union, Britishness was in many ways an artificially constructed identity, a top-down construct. And somewhere through the long decades following the Act of Union, and particularly in the post-imperial period, a sense that Englishness was lost within Britishness. And I think that's very true. And for many people, certainly in my mother's generation, Englishness and Britishness were sort of interchangeable or coterminous. And I know that's been particular irritation to people in Scotland. And I know Scotland quite well, as you know. I've been my best friend teaches at Glasgow University. I've been coming a lot to Scotland for years, and particularly interested in Scottish politics. So much so that I was known as Mr. Scotland at the New Statesman when I first became editor, because I was broadly correct about what was coming down the line. That once the SNP won a majority at Holyrood, there would be an independence referendum from which everything that's happened would flow. So what I've tried to do in the book is what I like about Britishness is it's nothing to do with kind of deep ancient roots. I like the fact it's non-civic, it's not ethnic nationalism, it's plural, it encourages compound identities, and it's particularly welcoming to migrants.
Yeah, you mentioned Stormzy in the book.
Stormzy, the rap superstar, talks about having a distinctively black British identity. He's uncomfortable with Englishness for obvious reasons, because Englishness, particularly in the 1970s, when Stormzy was young, was often associated with reaction or whiteness or racism. If you think about the far-right factions that used to follow the English football team, and the flag of St. George back then was seen in some ways, was flown by either the far right or eccentrics. But the flag of St. George in recent years has been reclaimed, particularly led by the English football team, particularly under Gareth Southgate, but before Southgate, right back to Euro 96. And there's definitely a sense of a more benign, more gentle, more open English identity, I think. And I feel it quite strongly. And it's not too dissimilar from Britishness. And I know the SNP, no nationalism is entirely benign, as we see this with the factions within Scottish nationalism and the creation of the Alpha Party and the fundamentalist wing of the SNP. So no nationalism is entirely benign. But I accept Sturgeon's view of a civic Scottish nationalism. Why can't the English have a similar civic nationalism as the Scots? And why can't the English be comfortable with their flag and their own identity in the way that the Scots are, and increasingly so? And one of the problems, I think, for the left and progressives in England is that they're often uncomfortable with the flag, with the nation, with patriotism, with the land, with place. And they shouldn't be, but they are for various reasons. Maybe it's to do with colonialism, the legacy of the empire. I don't know what it is. I have a sense of what it is, but I don't know for sure. But what I think the SNP have successfully done have redefined a sense of Scottish nationhood and a sense of Scottish identity and patriotism too, and the flag. And what the Scottish Parliament has enabled Scots to do is kind of reimagine themselves in the country. And England hasn't been given the same opportunity. We don't have an English Parliament. There aren't discrete English institutions. So there's no state. England doesn't have a state, doesn't have a seat at the United Nations. So, England is lost within Britain, as indeed the Scots might say. Scotland has been lost within Britain, within the multinational state. But Scotland at least has its own parliament, and it certainly has a strong sense of its own identity, or stronger sense of its own identity. You've mentioned several times a sense of Englishness being defined by class, an upper class, superior, aloof. That's nonsense. There are many different Englands, and the England of Stormzy is not the England of Boris Johnson, and the England of Harlow, Newtown in Essex, isn't the England of Mrs. Duffy and Rochdale, nor is it the England of Liverpool and Newcastle and Manchester. And some of these cities are much closer to Scottish cities in their sense of identity. And that's one of my problems I have with hard Scottish nationalism, is that sometimes I think the hard Scottish nationalists don't always pause to consider what might be lost as well as gained from the breakup of Britain. Yeah. What about all those millions of people from migrant backgrounds who feel very comfortable with a British identity for the reasons that I've outlined, and fear that being taken from them if the British state breaks up? and then forced to grapple with a new identity. So one of the reasons I'm writing, I think, urgently about the English question is because this concerns me. I mean, if Britain is to break up, what becomes of England and the English? And I'm not talking about a seat on the United Nations Security Council or great power politics or nuclear weapons in Scottish waters. All of those things are important, but that isn't the heart of my book, which is more about identity and a sense of place.
And maybe the most attractive version of that in your book is Southgateism, which I think one of the writers you mentioned calls it. And that sense that change is actually being led by people like Raheem Sterling and Marcus Rashford, who are young black men who, got dogs abuse, missing penalties at the European Championships, but have actually, between them, achieved possibly more social good than most politicians do in a lifetime. And Southgate has sort of encouraged all this, and actually maybe drawing the line between nationalism and patriotism. One being preferable to the other, and I think that's probably what Nicola Sturgeon would say. She wishes they didn't have the word nationalist attached to them, I think, these days because of its connotations. But that open, the ability to support the England team regardless of your colour or regardless of your ethnic background or your economic background or whatever. But the other thing with England is you've had to absorb a lot more than Scotland has. You have a large immigrant population. Scotland is still disgustingly white. We have a tiny sort of people of colour immigration thing, and we haven't had some of those maybe clashes that you've seen in aspects in places of England. God, I wish we had more of it, but that perhaps in a sense that homogeneity in Scotland has made it easier for the SNP to, they haven't had to wrestle with some of the challenges that you've had. And
yeah, I think that's absolutely the case, and England's had to absorb, I think, more successfully than any other European country, waves of migrants from different backgrounds and ethnicities and religions, and then more recently from Eastern Europe. I think there was pushback, as we've spoken about Farageism earlier, but nevertheless, I think England has absorbed migrant communities more successfully than France, for example, or indeed Sweden or Denmark. There's a huge experiment taking place in Germany now after Merkel opened the borders following the Syrian the refugee crisis created by the Syrian civil war, and Germany's grappling with some of the issues that England grappled with in the 1970s. And you spoke about Boris Johnson's cabinet of Etonians. Well, there aren't many Etonians in the cabinet, but Sunak and Priti Patel and Nadhim Zahawi. It's a very diverse cabinet. Labour slightly less diverse, surprisingly, than the Conservatives. But yeah, you're right about that, and immigration in relation to Scottish identity. But that will change. That will come, particularly if Scotland breaks from the UK and rejoins the EU.
Indeed.
Which I know is the ambition of Nicola Sturgeon.
It's not necessarily current policy here at the moment. One of the things that you talked about, I think England being the largest country in Europe not to have its own political institutions, so there's no forum to debate Englishness or to reimagine the country and to have a democratic reimagining of the country. I wonder about an English Parliament. Obviously, we know about the problems with a federal UK just because of the sheer scale of England compared to the others and the consequences that might have for the rest of us. But I'm also really interested in, I mentioned earlier, that rise of community spirit and community interest that's followed lockdown and continues with working from home. But also then, I guess the advent of the directly elected mayors with Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester and Andy Street in the West Midlands, etc. That whether the England we're talking about, I'm not talking about balkanised England, that's far too strong, but actually a sort of an England composed of different parts that are all comfortable-ish with their own more regional identity, that find ways to work together or even compete together, and whether that's the way to put together an England of the future. It's not necessarily a nation with its own parliament, but it is almost like a mini union on its own, within its own borders. What
I mean, you sound like Gordon Brown.
Yeah, probably.
Gordon's always dreaming, isn't he, of a kind of England broken into units, not a balkanized England, but a regionalized England. There's no, as yet, there is no kind of bottom-up movement for an English Parliament. That's for sure. There's a lot of elite chatter about it, you know, in the New Statesman and other liberal journals, but there's not much on the streets. There is a greater need people feel a greater need to take control over local decision making. So more devolution in England is desired, no doubt about it. And there's a lot of disaffection about the way local government works here, and how powerless local councils are, and how impoverished, and how so much local decision making is ultimately overturned at a county level. So decisions taken locally, it then gets overturned at a county level, and then ultimately it will get overturned at a national level if the appeals are often, there are a series of failures. So there's real desire, I think, for more local autonomy. I don't think there's a desire for an English Parliament, though I think it could be desirable. I think we absolutely need a constitutional reconfiguration, though, within these islands. I do think the status quo is unacceptable. I think we need an abolition of the House of Lords and a replacement with, I don't know what, maybe a kind of Senate of the nations and the regions. All of this needs to be thought through by you and your organisation, Chris, and others like it. Probably not for this call, but I don't think. And then there's the challenge. I found the last few days quite poignant with the aged monarch, you know, a very distinguished figure, the Queen Elizabeth, and she's kind of one of the last unionists. Yeah, I mean, she's held it all together, and I wonder, with her inevitable passing, what follows, not only for the institution of the monarchy, but for the so-called United Kingdom. And then you have Sinn Féin rising on both sides of the Irish border, in the north and in the Republic, and somewhere down the line will we be facing a simultaneous border poll and a reunified Ireland? And then what would that mean? I mean, these are big questions, but all of this lies ahead, I think. And will we have a second independence referendum in Scotland? I don't know. I don't think anytime soon.
No, it's not likely. So just before we finish up, probably.
Hi, Jason. I'm sorry. I'm not sure if we've lost Chris there for a moment.
Yeah, we have lost Chris. He's frozen. He's frozen on my screen. I wonondered if I'd frozen or whether it was Chris.
That's exactly what I was doing there for a second. Just kind of, I think Chris was coming to an end. He may come back to us.
Is there a question you want to ask? I see there's a few things in the chat.
I think, unfortunately, if anybody does have a question, they want to put their hands up. Sometimes people tend to, yes. Just have a one of the things that I was going to ask you was this idea of Englishness as one entity, and obviously, you know, England is so much greater than the size of Scotland. We have a Scottish identity, whether you've got your regional elements within that. Edinburgh is very different to Glasgow, but particularly linking back to what Chris was saying at the start about Boris and that side of Englishness, that's very different to the north of England.
Absolutely.
And the regionalisation and the things that are going on there, what does that mean for the different elements of Englishness? What the north that tends to be forgotten, how does that fit into this kind of idea of Englishness?
Sorry about that.
Chris is back. I've just been asked quite a challenging question about what is England? What is it? I think what I'm more interested in is what, in all of its diversity and difference, what makes a nation cohere? What helps us move towards what I call a politics of the common good? You know, what is it that can bring people together rather than push them apart? Obviously, moments of grand national occasion, you know, the Jubilee through which we've just passed. In England, a big national football tournament, when England are doing well, that tends to unify the nation when nearly everyone you meet is talking about the football. But when these moments aren't happening, what makes a people and a nation cohere? I think that's a huge challenge, particularly when there is a democratic deficit in parts of England as well as in Scotland. But also England is very divided between the cities and the towns, between the graduate class and the early school leavers, between the young and old, between homeowners and those who rent, the debt-burdened students, and so it goes on. And Labour in many ways has become the party of the sort of urban, educated middle classes or the graduate middle classes, and it's begun to lose connection in its old heartlands. So it's very hard, I think, for Labour to win a majority, particularly when it has lost so much support in Scotland. And also, what the local election recently showed us is that no one political party can speak for the nation, by which I mean the British nation, as opposed to the English nation. So it is a period of fragmentation and polarization, and ultimately, I'm asking the questions rather than providing answers about what unites us and what brings us together. You're right. What unites someone in Newcastle with someone in Berkshire, or someone in Essex with someone in Islington? But the same questions could be asked about Scotland. What unites someone in a small town in the Highlands with someone living and working in central Glasgow, or someone living in northeast Aberdeenshire, and with someone working as a lawyer in the centre of Edinburgh. I mean, Scotland itself is also a diverse country. Also, you've got your old religious and sectarian divisions, which I think we've largely transcended. Anyway.
Well, listen, Kevin Pringle, just before we finish, because it's good to have a question from the audience. Kevin, you have actually a really interesting question. Do you want to ask it?
Oh, thanks very much. Hello, Jason. Yeah, it was just to ask, I know you referred to PR a bit earlier on, but had we had PR across the UK, over the last sort of generation or so, would that have created a very different political personality for England than the one that we've been talking about this morning?
I think, Kevin, I think it would, and I support PR actually, not least because wherever I lived, I tend to vote, and I get a Conservative MP, for which I never vote. So it's incredibly frustrating. Also, it would give, as we've seen in Scotland, smaller parties would have an opportunity to rise and win representation, and we see that with the Scottish Greens, Holyrood. Of course, under PR we would have had all of those UKIP MPs, but maybe that would have been democracy. One has to accept what's in play. I also think under PR you would have seen new parties created. I think the Labour Party would have split, and you'd probably have a left-wing socialist party and a more kind of Blairite party, more closer to what we see in France with Macron and Macronism. And you would have probably seen Europhile conservatives like David Gauke and Rory Stewart and others would have very happily moved into that sort of Blairite or centrist liberal party, whereas they would felt very uncomfortable moving into Corbyn's Labour Party. So yeah, I think you would have had a completely different political landscape. There is an opportunity for PR. I don't think Starmer's not an imaginative thinker, but if he ends up as Prime Minister, he will only end up as Prime Minister with the support of the Liberal Democrats, possibly one or two Greens. And would he do a deal with the SNP? I can't see that happening.
No.
And that's one of the great challenges for progressives in Britain, is the rise of the SNP. Because here you've got a strong party and a movement that ultimately wants independence. It wants to break the British state. And it means that other progressive parties in England can't work with them, which creates problems. So, yeah, we would have, Kevin, I think we would have had a completely different political landscape. Tony Blair had the opportunity, of course, in '97 when he won his landslide. He began his constitutional program of reform and change, but he didn't go all the way. And he ditched Paddy Ashdown's Lib Dems pretty quickly. Before the 97 election, there was a lot of back channel conversations between Mandelson and Ashdown and others about PR, because Labour thought they might at one point need support from the Liberal Democrats, who were pretty strong back then. What did they get? High 50s, early 60s in seats. But Blair won such a convincing majority in 97, he didn't need them. And that's the problem with Labour. When they win majorities, they realise they've won under the first past the post, and they want to retain complete control of that system. But I think it's going to be very hard for them to win next time. But that's all to play for.
Sliding doors moments. Well, listen,
sliding doors moment.
We're out of time. I'm just gonna. You probably can't see this properly because of my weird voodoo back. They get it there.
I can show it though, Chris.
There you go. That's better.
Who are we now? Stories of Modern England.
It's a great book, and it's the quality of the conversation we've had here. It's like that, but there's much more of it, and fantastic little vignettes all the way through it. It's a really enjoyable read, which books like this aren't always, but this one definitely is. So thank you, Jason, for joining us today. I'll just say that we have on the 16th, we've got a panel of senior civil servants who are going to talk about the future of the civil service and what might happen there. And then at the end of the month, we have Gideon Rachman, the FT's Foreign Affairs columnist, who'll be talking about his new book, The Age of the Strongman. So keep your eyes on your inboxes and on social media, and we will hopefully see you at those. But again, to thank you, Jason, for giving us your time today. That was a really engrossing conversation, and I'm sure lots of them will want to pick up your book afterwards. Yeah, we shall speak to you soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody, and thank you for your time and your questions, Chris. Very enjoyable indeed. Thank you.
All the best.
Cheers.